Hello and a very warm welcome to today's IISS webinar, Southeast Asia's Evolving Security. I'm Robert Ward, IISS Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy. And in today's webinar, we're going to be looking at the rapidly changing security environment and political dynamics of Southeast Asia, which is of course also one of the world's most strategically and economically important regions. And one where the interests of China, the US and its allies meet head on, of course, too. Indeed, the timing of this session couldn't be better, given the intense schedule of ASEAN meetings this week and into next, both intra-ASEAN and ASEAN meetings with key interlocutors, including the US, China, Japan, and others. As you will have seen in the news today, we've already had some tense exchanges between China and the US over the South China Sea at these meetings. As ever, we have a real treat for you today with four of our exceptional IISS experts who will guide us through the main issues involving the region and its security. And thanks to the wonders of virtual communications, our presenters are also spread out as internationally as our audience is today, as our large audience is today, I might add. By way of introduction, in order of appearance, I'm pleased to introduce first Dr. Lynn Kuok, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security. Lynn works on the international relations, law and security of the Asia-Pacific with a focus on the South China Sea dispute. Lynn joins us from Washington, DC in the US. Then Dr. Euan Graham, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security too. Euan has a special research interest in maritime affairs in Southeast Asia and relations with the major powers. Euan joins us from somewhere near Melbourne, I am reliably informed. Then Yuka Koshino, Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy. Yuka conducts research in this area as part of the newly established IISS Japan Chair Program. Yuka joins us from Tokyo. And finally, but not least, Connelly, who leads the IISS Program on Southeast Asian Political Change and Foreign Policy, which examines the intersection of domestic politics and the international relations of the region. Aaron joins us from Singapore. Before we start, I'd like to outline the order of play today and give you some housekeeping rules. This webinar will last around an hour. I'll start by inviting each of our four panelists to give a brief 5-minute overview of the main issues on Southeast Asian security from their viewpoints, after which we will open the virtual floor to questions. Could I have the Q&A slide, please, Tom? Thank you. I know many of you, most of you, perhaps all of you will be familiar with the logistics of webinar Q&A, but just to be absolutely safe, I'm going to explain the procedure now. To ask a written question, please use the Q&A button, or to ask a question directly, please raise the blue hand, and our wonderful technical team will unmute you. You can write your question at any time, of course, during the webinar. Where we can, we will group similar questions so we can answer as many of them as possible. It's always good to have questions lined up, so please don't be shy and please don't hold back. And please always, it helps us if you state your affiliation when asking a question. I'll need to be strict with time, so if you want to ask a question, please limit yourself just to one question, and questions please, not statements. And finally, this session is on the record and will be posted on due course on the Institute's website at www.iiss.org. So Lynn, Euan, Yuka and Aaron, warm welcome to today's webinar. And Lynn, over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robert, and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to make 3 points today. My first point is that US-China relations are badly broken, and in the words of the English nursery rhyme, it's going to be very difficult to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Second, deteriorating relations between the United States and China are narrowing strategic choices in Southeast Asia, and this is putting Southeast Asian countries in an impossible bind. Third, Southeast Asian countries are attempting to create strategic space for themselves, but their success is largely going to depend on their ability to forge a principled path for themselves, as well as their ability to forge stronger ties with middle powers. So on the first point, US-China relations, much blame has been put on President Donald Trump's doorstep for the deteriorating US-China relations. But his trade war and attempts to seize on the China issue to boost his re-election chances have merely fanned the flames of an already troubled relationship. Relations have been hurt over a whole range of issues: the South China Sea, trade and other economic issues, ties with Hong Kong, Taiwan, human rights. All these issues have badly hurt the US-China relationship. But in the last, I would say, half a year or more, we've seen a gradual evolving from when these issues have become causes of deteriorating relations to where these issues have become really means by which the United States and China hope to gain strategic advantage over the other. For instance, no one is under any illusion that the recent high-profile US statement endorsing the Philippines case against China in 2016, endorsing the tribunal's decision in the Philippines case against China in 2016, arose from anything apart from intensifying US-China rivalry. Now, a Biden administration is unlikely to bring much of a change in my view, though less inflammatory rhetoric might well help to foster more stable relations. Indeed, a greater emphasis on human rights by a democratic administration could further exacerbate tensions, as could the retention of the more ideological approach that we've seen senior members of the Trump administration adopt in recent months. Now, very much focus in terms of considering the longevity of the deteriorating US-China ties has been placed on the US side of the equation. But if we look at the Chinese end as well, with the United States throwing everything and the kitchen sink at China in the last few months, I doubt that China is going to be very quickly forgetting this. So their belief that the United States is out to maintain its regional hegemony in the region, as well as to clip China's wings, is going to be retained. And as a result, what we're going to see is redoubled attempts on China's part to exclude the United States from the region and to increase Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. Now, on implications for Southeast Asia, tensions between the superpowers are narrowing Southeast Asia's strategic options. I think this was best spelled out by Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in his recent piece for Foreign Affairs. The reasons for this have been well rehearsed, but nonetheless bear repeating. The US is an indispensable security partner in Southeast Asia. It's also the largest source of foreign direct investment for much of Asia, though China is fast catching up. On China's part, it's the largest trading partner of many countries in Asia, including all US allies. It's been the largest trading partner of ASEAN for more than a decade now. Moreover, Southeast Asian countries consider the wind behind China's economic sales. So the economic trajectory is perceived as being in China's favor. So I think the dilemma that the region has faced in respect of how to position itself between the United States and China was well captured in the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which was issued last July. I do not have time to touch on that more right now, but I am happy to take questions on that. In terms of how Southeast Asia is seeking to carve out a strategic space for itself, I think it's doing at least three things. One, it's seeking to strengthen the role of ASEAN and seeking to reassert ASEAN centrality. But I think incantations of ASEAN centrality are not going to make it. So I think the true test will be how the organization or the association manages to handle hotspots in the region, such as the South China Sea. Code of conduct negotiations on the South China Sea are taking place under ASEAN's auspices, but few believe that any meaningful code of conduct is going to be concluded. Second, ASEAN is seeking to improve ties with middle powers like Australia, India, and Japan. My colleagues will be touching on this, but suffice it to say that its ability to improve ties with middle powers, as well as the middle powers' capacity to step up to the plate, is going to be critical. Third, many Southeast Asian states have also sought to stress the importance of international law. This is significant, though often overlooked. in a situation where we're facing, where it's often said that Southeast Asia faces a choice between the United States and China, I think it's important for them to be able to reframe the competition as not between the United States and China, but with one between a world where rules govern or where might governs. And I think insofar as Southeast Asia is able to frame that choice as one where principles must govern and they take the side of principles, they will be in a better position. So in conclusion then, US-China competition is here to stay. Southeast Asian countries are trying to avoid taking sides in US-China rivalry, but this cannot mean taking no stance at all. They need to be more proactive in taking active steps to defend a rules-based order. But even with such a stance, I think the terrain will be increasingly difficult for Southeast Asian countries as we see decoupling take place between the United States and China across a range of fronts. Much will depend on whether Southeast Asian countries individually and collectively can forge ties with middle powers who are themselves facing headwinds, both within their own countries as well as because of US-China competition. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm sure we're going to be talking more about middle powers and how countries in ASEAN, how they can stop having not choose between the US and China. I just wanted to, with a quick question, if I may, before we go to Euan, just have get your views on whether you think the pandemic, whether that's changed the dynamics, particularly in the region, particularly with regard to the South China Sea uncertainty and disputes that are going on there.
I think the pandemic has reinforced dynamics in the South China Sea. It hasn't changed anything. We've seen since, even last year before the pandemic, China escalating or intensifying its activities in the South China Sea with various incursions into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. So in 2017 and 2018, what we saw was China actually warning off Vietnam against developing its own oil and gas resources in its EEZ. But from 2019 onwards, China actually began to actively survey for oil and gas in Vietnam's EEZ. And we saw this occur through the pandemic as well, which surprised everyone, of course, because they were perhaps expecting better behavior from China. But we saw China actually, collide or hit a Vietnamese fishing vessel. And for the first time, at least the first reported time, it's actually sought to harass Malaysian vessels in Malaysia's EEZ as it seeks itself to survey Malaysian waters. So China's activities have intensified through the pandemic, but I mean, these activities started way beforehand.
Thank you, Lynn. Euan, over to you, please, now, if I may.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Good evening, everybody from Australia. I'm going to talk about three things. I will continue the theme on US-China rivalry and what it means for Southeast Asia. And then I'm going to focus on two particular major power relationships, Australia and India. So starting with the big weather-setting relationship, I think it's important when looking at the implications of Sino-US rivalry for Southeast Asia. It's important to realize that it was actually China that decoupled from the US first. China is seeking to make Southeast Asia part of an economic hinterland that ties surrounding countries into a made-in-China standards and supply chain, with China sitting atop of the value chain. This is not just an economic construct. Beijing uses economic leverage to induce acceptance of the Communist Party's political and strategic interests. That's a fairly forward assumption, but I think it's an important one because we always come back to this question of Southeast Asia not wanting to choose between the US or China. But I think no active choice means China by default in most cases. And that's simply because Southeast Asia was already on the China bus in economic terms at the starting point of Sino-US strategic competition. China's economic influence over Southeast Asian elites has only strengthened since then, while the US counteroffer has weakened under President Trump. This is about more than the co-optation of elites, however. It's about structurally tying the sub-region, into a Chinese-centered imperium. There are significant country-level variations. China's influence is more concentrated in continental Southeast Asia than in the Maritime zone, but even that difference is lessening in my view. Across Southeast Asia, the United States is still often significantly more popular than China at a grassroots level, but this is not a popularity contest. China's economic pull in the sub-region is likely to strengthen post-pandemic, and Washington needs to do more than simply point out China's bad behavior if Southeast Asians are to make active choices in its direction. Deepening ties with Australia, India, and Japan also helped Southeast Asian countries to diversify their economic exposure to China and to hedge in strategic terms. But fundamentally, economic linkages are likely to be the deciding factor over time. ASEAN is increasingly divided and marginalized on issues that rub up against China's core interests, like the South China Sea, and we've seen that played out today. This strategic impotence is a function of Beijing's growing power and influence. And the pandemic has unfortunately exposed this shortfall, including for countries like Australia, which maintain a strong declaratory commitment to ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. So to drill down on the two countries, Australia, well, parts of maritime Southeast Asia have long been included within Australia's area of direct strategic interest. Australia has maintained forces and strong defense linkages in Southeast Asia since the Second World War for this reason. In early July, there was a defense strategic update released by the Australian Department of Defense, and that affirmed and strengthened the commitment to Southeast Asia, highlighting the importance of the South China Sea to Australia's security. And I think Canberra will continue to maintain a military presence through the Five Power Defence arrangements and other minilateral and bilateral arrangements, including exercises with the United States. Its strongest links are with Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, but Australia has been making efforts to extend beyond these traditional poles to the Philippines, Vietnam, even Brunei. Australia has repeatedly learned not to overload any one relationship, especially that with Jakarta. The final point is more of a challenge. Australia is struggling to resource its defence engagement in Southeast Asia at the same time that it is stepping up in the Southwest Pacific. And that's serious because Southeast Asia, in geopolitical terms, actually counts in greater value in my view. For a long time, Australia has struggled to make headway on economic diversification with Southeast Asia due to protectionism in the sub-region, lack of complementarity, and the conservatism of Australian business elites. Ironically, however, China is now helping to change this as its overt economic coercion of Australia forces export businesses to reassess their risk. But turning to India, India has put Southeast Asia at the center of transforming its long-standing Look East policy into an Act East policy under Prime Minister Modi. Economically, the emphasis on building infrastructure connections into Southeast Asia through regional organizations such as BIMSTEC has been significant. India is the only country apart from China with any geo-economic equity in Myanmar. But India is not a strong multilateral player in Southeast Asia, and ASEAN was understandably disappointed by the debacle of Delhi's withdrawal from the RCEP free trade negotiations. However, Prime Minister Modi has played a significant role in helping to sell the Indo-Pacific concept to Indonesia and through Indonesia to ASEAN via his 2018 Shangri-La Dialogue speech. The two traditional poles for India's sub-regional diplomacy are Singapore and Vietnam. But like Australia, Delhi has also been playing in new territory with a recent emphasis on Indonesia in particular, and also playing to Indic civilizational links between the two. Achieving a form of stickiness between two prominent non-aligned states is always difficult, but India has made offers, concrete offers of naval cooperation, and it's often forgotten that Indonesia and India have a shared maritime boundary. There's also been efforts to open relations with Philippines and some tensions with Malaysia over support there for Kashmir at an individual level. Finally, in maritime and naval terms, India doesn't just have a commercial stake in the South China Sea, but it does take serious interest in freedom of navigation and the security of sea lines of communication in and around the region, extending into the South China Sea. As an example of that, recently, the Indian Navy deployed a warship to the South China Sea during a period of heightened tension with China in the Himalayas, as a signal, I think, that India can make life difficult for China in the maritime domain as far away as the South China Sea, especially in closer coordination with Washington. So I'll leave it there, Robert, and look forward to everybody's questions and comments.
Thank you, Euan. Actually, your point about the region, sort of China by default, I think that's a very strong point, and I hope we get a chance to sort of delve a bit deeper into that a bit later in the discussion. So interesting point. A quick question to you. I mean, I'm glad you talked about India because it's so central for, particularly for Japan, and we're going to talk to Yuka in a second about Japan in the region, but it's so central to the region's stability, but obviously has a non-aligned DNA. How reliable a partner do you think India will be in promoting Indo-Pacific stability?
Well, I think there's a lot on Prime Minister Modi to prove that he can put his money where his mouth is, as it were. There's been a lot of rhetorical investment in the Look East policy, but it's been rather slow for the obvious reason that I think the Indian economy has not been as dynamic as he would like and others would like to see too. And fundamentally, national strength flows from economic strength. However, I think the strategic calculation is changing rather sharply, and it's changing under the shadow of increased tension with China across the land border. And that is forcing India's hand, I think, to come out in less hedging terms, certainly in terms of closer cooperation in the defense field with the United States, as an extrapolation of that, greater assertiveness on the quadrilateral talk, which binds in India and with Australia and Japan and the United States, and all these bilateral relationships that I was talking about earlier in Southeast Asia. I think the economic question is really the one that's hardest to push, but that will have to follow the strategic dimension, which I think at the moment is really the key one for Delhi.
India, of course, going to have one of its worst economic years this year for decades and decades. Quite a tough time for its economy, of course. Thank you, Euan. Yuka, please.
Thank you, Robert. And good evening, everyone from Tokyo. And so today I would like to speak about the growing importance of Japan's strategic role in Southeast Asia, especially under the ever-intensifying US-China strategic rivalry that Lynn mentioned, and driven by the COVID-19 pandemic. So first, I will start from outlining how Japan views security in the region. And then I will talk about how the government is trying to step up to fill in its role. And then I will talk about some opportunities and challenges that Japan will face going on forward. So first, on Japan's view on security, Japan broadly has two concerns in the region. One is the rising Chinese assertiveness in the military and economic realm. There's an enduring and increasing concern of China's ever-growing maritime assertiveness in the South China Sea and challenges to the rule-based maritime order. And Japan's also concerned about increasing economic coercion and the spread of China's physical and digital infrastructure projects, which often does not meet the quality infrastructure principles, including high security standards and debt sustainability and transparency that was shared in the region and promoted by the G20 countries. Japan is also concerned about China's tactics to approach countries bilaterally to undermine ASEAN unity to advance its own political and strategic goals in the South China Sea or the Mekong region. Second is the declining US engagement in the region. For Japan, the #1 priority for regional security is to keep US robust military, economic, and political commitment in the region. However, under the Trump administration, the president and senior officials have often skipped or have not been effectively present at regional key meetings. And key meetings like the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN-centered ministerial meetings. So regional poll surveys clearly show that regional countries perceive that US engagement in the region has sharply declined since the Trump administration came into office. In contrast, the similar poll surveys show that Japan has been top in terms of the most trusted and confident strategic partner for ASEAN countries. So Japan's recent diplomatic activism in the region, even during the COVID-19 pandemic, could be seen as Japan's best response to meet these changing situations and expectations from the regional countries and partners as the most trusted and important strategic partner to keep the region free and open from coercion. I will attempt to highlight some of Japan's recent initiatives since the COVID-19 outbreaks. So first, on diplomacy. The Japanese government made some strong commitment to support the region through virtual summits and senior official visits. In the virtual ASEAN +3 meeting held in April, for instance, it proposed to set up an ASEAN Center for Emerging Diseases and Public Health Emergencies to enhance real-time transparent information sharing system. And then most importantly, Foreign Minister Motegi Toshimitsu visited 8 ASEAN countries in the region in August as the first senior foreign officials in these countries and demonstrated Japan's strong commitment in the region. On financial support to deal with the pandemic, Japan International Cooperation Agency, for instance, was also quick to set up a COVID-19 emergency government-backed yen loan fund of more than $2 billion and started providing them to regional countries, including Myanmar and Philippines, and has been received well by the local government. And then in terms of economic connectivity that Japan has been pushing since its launch of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific vision, Japan has also made the first move and played a leading role to restructure the supply chain in the Indo-Pacific region after the pandemic. As early as April, the government allocated funding in their supplemental budget to Japanese companies moving facilities out from China to the ASEAN countries or Southeast Asia in general. And recently, it launched a supply chain resilience initiative, which includes India, Australia, and Southeast Asia to restructure the supply chain. This also has a strategic meaning to set roles and frameworks towards to bring back momentum in the RCEP negotiations. In terms of security, contacts between militaries were limited during the pandemic, but Japan has continued to seek ways to provide capacity building efforts to regional countries. Most recently, Japan and the Philippines signed the first deal in which Japan will offer radar systems to track fighter jets and missiles in the South China Sea. So even under the health and economic global crisis, the Prime Minister Abe's focus on diplomacy and its commitment on the free and open Indo-Pacific vision enabled Japan to demonstrate certain leadership role on these kind of initiatives. But of course, challenges remains and there are some future risks. First, there's a question about how much diplomatic capacity the next Japanese Prime Minister will have after Prime Minister Abe resigns. Second, Japan is also, due to the demographic changes and decrease in social spending, Japan is facing severe fiscal constraint and the resources are limited. Thirdly, and most importantly, the US regional commitment remains to be uncertain, at least in the short term towards the November presidential election. The key questions for Japan going forward is, could Japan continue to play a leading role without US regional presence? And could Japan at least mobilize other like-minded countries to keep the region free and open, rule-based liberal international order? This will include questions about how Japan could strengthen the multilateral regional cooperation and how it could bring in regional like-minded partners like Australia and India in these situations to make the region resilient against Chinese coercive tactics. And another key, maybe looking ahead in the future, perhaps 2021 might be one of the important years for Japan, as it will serve as the chair for the Japan-Mekong Summit. So whether or not Tokyo can make this a meaningful event would also be one of the keys for Japan's strategic position in the region. I will stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Yuka. We've already got a couple of questions on post-Abe Japan diplomacy, so we'll steer them your way when the Q&A comes. But one question I wanted to ask you, you did mention free and open Indo-Pacific a couple of times, FOIP, obviously a signature policy of foreign policy of the Abe administration. Do you think that the FOIP concept will outlive the Abe administration?
Thank you. Yes, so back in 2016, when Prime Minister Abe first discussed about his vision or his strategy back then about the free and open Indo-Pacific, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Indo-Pacific, it was pretty much pictured as Prime Minister Abe's initiative. But over time, as many of our panelists also discussed, well, first of all, the United States used the same free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP word for its regional strategy, diplomatic, economic, and also in the security realm. And then other regional countries like Australia, India, and even Southeast Asia, although the meeting might be a little bit, there might be a little bit of a gap in terms of division, still embraces the principles that the Japan launched, including the inclusiveness and free and open. So the free and open Indo-Pacific has become something that is not just Prime Minister Abe's initiative or Japan's initiative, but became a more kind of public initiative supported by regional countries, but also beyond the region, including UK and France. So in my view, I think it will continue no matter who becomes the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Yuka. And Aaron, over to you, please.
Thanks, Robert. For some of you who have tuned in, you would have received an email or would have seen a tweet with a photo of a commuter train on our invitation. And you're probably wondering why a seminar about regional security dynamics has a photo of a commuter train. And the reason is because that commuter train, which is Jakarta's new MRT, only in operation for just a little bit over a year, was supported by JICA, was supported by the Japanese government, and is something that I think that a lot of Indonesians and Jakartans in particular are very excited about the development of this train, and it's something that wouldn't have happened without the assistance of the Japanese government. I think there's a question, though, of just how much leverage Japan receives for its contributions to Southeast Asia's development, as opposed to, say, Chinese contributions to Southeast Asia's development. So by contrast, you also have a high-speed rail that's being built from Jakarta to Bandung. It's about 2.5 years overdue. It should have been done last year. And that's being built with financing from China Development Bank. And that seems to have garnered China a lot of political leverage in Indonesia. And so I think there's this question as to how much each country is getting out of what it puts into the relationships. And it leads into a couple of points that I'd like to make. The first is on oligarchic politics in Southeast Asia. There's obviously a wide variety of polities in Southeast Asia, from absolute monarchy in Brunei to illiberal democracies in the Philippines and Indonesia. But broadly, in each Southeast Asian country, there are generally a small number of large conglomerates that are controlled by a single individual that play a big role in that country's politics. And in Indonesia, oftentimes, these leaders of capital form their own political parties, their own political vehicles. They're very transparently behind those political vehicles. In other countries, they spread their money around, and it's a little bit more diverse. But the key point here is that many of these leaders of capital have really strong links to local politics. They have quite a say in local politics, unless they've somehow found themselves on the outs with the current regime. And they also increasingly have close links back to Beijing, or at the very least to capital in China, in Hong Kong or Shanghai. And increasingly these individuals, many of whom may have been Western educated, have a relatively negative view of the West and a relatively positive view of China. Again, these are broad generalizations. This is not true in every case, but oftentimes they are urging their governments and their contacts in politics in these countries to adopt a more favorable view of Beijing, or at the very least to tone down some of the criticism of, for instance, Beijing's activities in the South China Sea. And so I think when Westerners ask, why isn't Southeast Asia taking a stronger stance on the South China Sea, or some of the depredations that we've seen in mainland Southeast Asia, for instance, along the Mekong, as Yuka mentioned? One of the answers is because the local politics, the domestic politics of Southeast Asian countries are not really set up to take those positions. There is significant pressure on governments in these countries to take positions that may not seem logical from Washington or from London, but they seem logical from Southeast Asian capitals. And I just want to add, I think too often this is caricatured as a kind of corruption. I don't think it's corruption. It's economic self-interest from the perspective of these large conglomerates, and in some cases, you could argue from the perspective of these governments, where they are balancing a kind of need, in some cases desperate need, for infrastructure investment in particular, which they are getting primarily from China, also from Japan, which is struggling to keep up with China as it pours more and more money into the region. But they need to be able to balance this need for investment with their strategic imperatives. And that is not always an easy choice for Southeast Asian states to make from their perspective. The second thing I was going to touch upon is just the popular support for authoritarianism in a number of Southeast Asian states. And this factors into how the leadership in these states perceive both the United States and China. So in the last several years, we've seen populist authoritarian leaders elected in both the Philippines and Indonesia, and moved both of those countries in a more liberal direction. We also see cases such as Thailand, where a junta took power in 2014 and has very liberal ideas about the future direction of that country. And oftentimes, when China demands or requests or asks the leadership of these countries to take a specific position on, say, the South China Sea, that is seen as less threatening to their regime stability, with possible exception of Vietnam and the Philippines, than some of the demands or the requests of the international community or the Western countries, certainly the United States, make on these countries' leadership as well. Because that often goes to the heart of whether or not they can remain in power. And so, for instance, in the case of Thailand in particular, where the US has, I think, is often unfairly criticized as supporting opposition, the United States has supported democracy in Thailand. But that support, neutral as it is, for democracy threatens the regime stability of the Prayut government in Thailand from their perspective. And so if we're looking for reasons why sometimes Southeast Asian countries make decisions that appear to not be in their national self-interest from the perspective of Washington or London, oftentimes it is related to these concerns, these deep concerns about regime stability. That's something that Washington and London really have to factor in if they're going to try to bring some of these Southeast Asian countries not over to their side, but into a cohesive alignment to stand up for their own geopolitical self-interest. I wonder, I don't know if we have very much time, but I just wanted to mention very briefly some of the discussions that have been happening virtually. They would have been happening in Hanoi today, but they've been happening virtually from across the region on the South China Sea in particular. The ASEAN countries have just agreed to a communique in the last couple of hours or so. I don't believe it's out yet. The text isn't out yet. But this was a really difficult agreement to strike. It came out about 36 hours after it should have been released because of continuing debates within ASEAN about how to approach the question of the South China Sea. And in particular, intense disagreements between the Philippines and Laos, which is, of course, has some of the closest economic connections to China in Southeast Asia. But the good news from the perspective of Southeast Asia is that they were actually able to come to an agreement. I'm told that the agreement does mention the need for countries to adhere to international law, such as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So sometimes Southeast Asian countries, they are able to make it work. They are able to take a unified stand in favor of international law and in favor of their geopolitical interests.
Thank you, Aaron, for that. Question on, just for me before I open it up to the floor, ASEAN countries have very large and varied healthcare needs, which have presumably been spotlighted by the pandemic. ASEAN countries have been a target of Chinese healthcare diplomacy. Japan's also offered some money to set up a healthcare facilities and so on. From with your knowledge of the dynamics of the region, how do the countries in ASEAN view sort of Chinese healthcare activity and the healthcare activity of others?
It's a really interesting question, and I'm glad you mentioned the diversity of the situation that Southeast Asian countries find themselves in, because you have Thailand, which has gone up to 101 days without any local transmission of COVID-19, seems to be doing very well. It really has had a world-class public health response. But of course, Thailand has long built up its medical tourism industry. It has some of the best hospitals in Asia. And so that wasn't by fate or coincidence. It has a system of local public health officers in every village, for instance. So it had prepared for something like this. Vietnam also has done very well, perhaps for similar reasons, combined with kind of authoritarian state that was able to very swiftly track COVID-19 infections. But if you look at Indonesia and the Philippines, we have to be honest, they're not doing very well. And that is because of a lack of leadership at the national level. And in particular, in Indonesia, we've just seen Jakarta go back into a form of lockdown, and I'm very concerned about the course of the pandemic there. But you do have, and this gets into the issue of Chinese vaccine diplomacy, which I think is going to be very important in the weeks and months to come. Sinovac in China has struck a deal with Biopharma, which is a state-owned enterprise in Indonesia. And although some Indonesian state-owned enterprises are not particularly efficient or high quality, Biopharma really is. It has one of the only BSL-3 laboratories in developing Southeast Asia, for instance. And it could really be a center of vaccine diplomacy for the region in partnership with either Sinovac or some Western vaccine manufacturers. And I think it is telling that China was the first mover here, went to Biopharma first to recruit Biopharma to conduct its phase 3 trials. And it is now struck a deal to supply 40 million doses of the vaccine for Indonesia by early next year. If China is seen as saving the region, particularly really vulnerable countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, from COVID-19, because they can't actually manage the crisis short of a vaccine, that will have long-term, long-lasting geopolitical consequences for how China is seen and how other countries are seen. And it is surprising to me that the United States does not appear to have been more active in vaccine diplomacy to date, either in the Philippines or Indonesia, where it's going to really matter in the months to come.
Marvelous. Thank you, Aaron. So over to the audience now for questions, and we've got some good written questions that have come in. I'm going to take the first one from Nishigaya Kasumi, who is a UN UN staff working on a peacekeeping mission. And the first question is to Lynn. In the face of increasingly expansionist China in the South China Sea and over the Spratlys, are the Southeast Asian countries engaging in building up their defense forces? And if so, how would you describe trends?
I think the first point to make is that Southeast Asian countries who have been at the forefront of Chinese incursions in the South China Sea have in fact sought to take a more forward-leaning position in the South China Sea by sending Coast Guard, Maritime Militia, etc., to respond to Chinese incursions in their EEZ. But that's quite a different, the other point to note as well is that they've taken an increasingly strong legal position on the South China Sea. So as a result of Malaysia's recent, and by recent I mean December 2019, submission to UN Commission on the the limits of the extended continental shelf, we've seen China make a very strong response. And as a result of that, countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, as well as Malaysia, retorting, coming back with responses of their own, which make very clear that claims in the South, maritime claims in the South China Sea have to accord with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and China's claims simply do not do so. So they, whether on the ground or in the sea, in the South China Sea, or in terms of the legal front, we've seen Southeast Asian countries take a stronger stance, but within limits, because they overall do not want to hurt broader relations with China. But in terms of building up its defense forces, I think Southeast Asian countries are going to face headwinds. We've talked about COVID-19, and this has had a hugely detrimental impact on local economies, which were in the first place not altogether strong to start off with. And we might see particular troubles being faced, as Aaron mentioned, by Indonesia, but also by Malaysia, which struggled with its economy even before COVID-19 hit. It can certainly do better. And so if we're thinking about Southeast Asian countries building up their defense forces, they're going to be facing constraints on resources. So that's one, the question of capacity, but also the question of willingness to do so in the face of a very strong Chinese neighbor. The consideration at the back of the mind is going to be, China, we need its help in terms of, vaccines on COVID-19. We also would like its help in rebuilding our economies post-COVID-19. What are we doing then by incurring China's wrath to build up our defense forces when in fact, it's a mere drop in the ocean compared to China's extensive and expansive military capabilities. So I think I don't see that to be very likely on the narrow question of building up defense forces.
Marvelous. Thank you, Lynn, for that. A question, I think this has got your name written on it, Euan, because I know you've been thinking about this. Question comes from Haridas Ramasamy. Do you see a Biden administration returning to an Obama-esque mode of engaging China and framing the South China Sea dispute in judicial terms rather than the current stark geostrategic terms?
Well, the flip answer is I hope not, but I also think that the indications from those advising Joe Biden, as far as one can tell, is that there is a broad realization and indeed a consensus across Washington on a lot of the substance around dealing with China in very different terms to 5 years ago, or precisely when China was able to make the advances in the South China Sea with relatively little pushback from the United States at the time. I think the broad recognition that there needs to be is that we're in a structural competition, and that whoever is in the incumbent, be it President Trump for another term or a President Biden, they're going to be facing an extremely knotty set of challenges on the China file, which could alone absorb the strategic attentions of the United States for the indefinite future. And I think some of that will inevitably flow through in continuity in the bifurcation of technology, for one example. I think how it's going to be framed will be obviously different. There will be a big political onus on discontinuity, just to demonstrate that that Biden is not Trump and wants to disown a lot of the, particularly the sort of frankly shambolic handling of allies and alliances. And I think alliances is going to be a strong home territory for Biden. But allies and alliances are not strategic goals in themselves; they're means to an end. The end really is the key question, and I think that the United States has to revive itself, but it can't revive itself by opting out of strategic competition in the hope that it can rejoin the fray in a stronger position in 5 years, because frankly China won't give it that space. It has to be in Southeast Asia in particular, offering positive inducements and not simply sanctions and stigmatizing, in correct terms, the bad behavior of China, but they need to be offering a positive agenda too. I hope they'll do it. We'll wait and see. Of course, there's the small matter of the election outcome.
If I could jump in there, Robert, on the question of whether we'll see a Biden administration returning to an Obama-esque mode of engaging China and framing the South China Sea dispute in juridical terms rather than the current struck geostrategic terms. I think we are likely to see a Biden administration being more skillful, at least in framing the dispute in the South China Sea about, in terms of it being about principles and a rules-based order. I think the most masterful statement on US interests in the South China Sea that I've seen during the Obama administration and during the Trump administration was really one that took place on the day after, or the day on of the South China Sea Tribunal ruling in the Philippines case against China in 2016. And that was by a senior national security advisor in Asia in the Obama administration, Dan Crittenbrink, who's now the US ambassador to Vietnam. And that clearly set out US interests in the South China Sea, as well as broader interests in a rules-based order. It was a very clear statement of the principles involved in the South China Sea. And so my first point is that, yes, I suspect that, the Biden administration might be more skillful in framing it in a different way. But I think fundamentally, the dispute being one about, geostrategic competition and which power is going to, which power is going to have hegemony in the region, that is going to be here to stay. It's a structural contest which remains, but I think the tools that might be availed, that the Biden administration might avail itself of, might be slightly different and perhaps a little bit more effective in this respect. I think the benefit of framing it in juridical terms will be also in terms of bringing in allies and partners in the region to support US efforts in the South China Sea. I think allies and partners in the region are far more willing to go along with something framed as support of a rules-based order, as opposed to something that's framed as a contest between the United States and China. And this really goes to US goals in the region. That's not very clear. Is it US goals to support the rules-based order? Is it to maintain US hegemony in the region? Or is it to go even further, regime change in China? So I think US allies and partners would be far more comfortable in terms of supporting a rules-based order, so that, however fierce competition gets between the United States and China, it still takes place within the framework of multilateralism and the rule of law.
Lovely, thanks Lynn and Euan. We've got some great questions that have come in. I'm going to give a klaxon now that we're going to be running about 10-15 minutes over, I suspect. So just to give everybody warning, but we've got some good questions. It's a shame not to deal with them. A question from Jordan Isaac. If you could identify yourselves and your questions, that's very welcome as well. But a question from Jordan Isaac for Yuka. Do you see key differences in Japanese foreign policy in the post-Abe era, given Abe's close relationships with President Trump and Prime Minister Modi?
Thank you. That's actually a good question and important one as well. So first of all, the simplest answer, I guess, is that if you look at the contenders for the next leaders race in the LDP, you will see that there's much focus, especially given the situation of COVID-19 and the economic challenges because of that pandemic, really shows that the candidates are quite focused on the domestic issues on their policy agenda. And I have not, at least, heard about any significant or dramatic policy changes, foreign policy changes from this free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Another point is that it's very important to also understand that Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was really quite a rare prime minister because of the political base that he had as the longest serving Japanese prime minister in history to seek a robust foreign policy agenda. And in the course of seeking that diplomatic agenda, he also was able to institutionalize some of his diplomacy and goals, including, for instance, if you look at the US-Japan, I mean, one of the legacy of Prime Minister Abe was to set up the National Security Council and National Secretariat, who could be the counterpart of the United States NSC. So you can see that there's close coordination between the two countries. And then this is not under the Trump administration, but the US-Japan alliance also under the Prime Minister Abe was able to upgrade the US-Japan security guidelines to enhance cooperation in new domains like the space and cyberspace. And even under the Trump administration, which a lot of the leaders around the world have difficulties dealing with, he was able to leverage its personal relations to continue to strengthen the alliance within these institutional frameworks. And if you also look at India-Japan relations, you can see that because of the personal relationship, the two countries have also been able to enhance the institutional frameworks, including the 2+2, the frameworks to deal with the foreign and strategic policies and goals, and to share their views on China and these other diplomatic agendas. And also, what's more, so even in terms of the multilateral framework that Prime Minister Abe tried to institutionalize, including the quadrilateral security dialogue, now there's a movement, even without the push from the Japanese government, these countries like India and Australia are coming together, and India's, there's increasing momentum to really make this framework more than a security dialogue, but also as an economic and more comprehensive strategic framework. So my conclusion is that I don't see any dramatic foreign policy changes in the post-Abe era at this moment, and it seems like the institutionalization of some of these efforts have enabled and to probably allow the continuation of this diplomatic framework.
Thank you, Yuka. A question for Aaron, I think, hand this one to you, and perhaps the others will want to chip in as well. This is my very own Tim Huxley, who leads the IISS Asia operations. Aaron, please discuss the prospects realistically for ASEAN's member states to coordinate their positions on regional security more effectively, and thereby provide a third way between alignment with one another of the major powers.
I think today's agreement on the communique, on the joint communique, which ASEAN reached, after quite a bit of negotiations, is an example of ASEAN, doing just that. It doesn't go as far as, say, the United States would like, but it certainly won't please Beijing either. There will be a reference to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There is longstanding ASEAN language that is very clearly directed at Beijing on these questions. Of course, Beijing also says that it is in compliance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, so it allows them to a little bit of a flub. But it sends a pretty clear signal to Beijing that its actions in the South China Sea are a continued source of tension with Southeast Asia. We also see a relatively unified ASEAN when it comes to the code of conduct negotiations, which haven't really progressed at all since last year. And there's broad dissatisfaction within ASEAN on that, even though I agree with Lynn, we're unlikely to see a substantive code of conduct emerge from these negotiations anyways. So I think there is an opportunity for ASEAN to come together and in a united way, cooperate on some of these big regional security issues. The question will be, as the United States under the Trump administration, continues to behave in the way that my colleagues have described, and as China becomes wealthier and more powerful and more influential in Southeast Asia, are there other Southeast Asian states beyond Cambodia, which is very clearly a Chinese client at this point, that will be willing to break ASEAN consensus and prevent the bloc from taking that kind of collective action in the future? And I think it's likely that will be the case, particularly if President Trump wins re-election in November, but perhaps even if he doesn't.
Anyone else want to chip in? Yes, Euan. Oh, and Lynn. Yes, Euan first, please.
I'm less optimistic on ASEAN, as you've probably gathered from my earlier comments, but I think we've had two tests. One is the South China Sea, but we've also had COVID-19. ASEAN was frankly missing in action for the first few months. There was a little bit of ASEAN Plus activity, but pretty minor. If the East Asia Summit was really going to fulfill its promise, there should have been an emergency East Asia Summit called within weeks. None of it happened, I think, for the obvious subtext that it was too sensitive to do that for China. So ASEAN, I think, found itself powerless. If things are going to change, it really will require Indonesia to weigh in the way that it has done in the past as the primus inter pares in ASEAN, the one that does the heavy lifting from behind in that very Indonesian style of leadership. But that's, I think, the thing that really has cost ASEAN very dearly in the last few years, that Indonesia has not really been externally focused or strategically minded. So under a potential future administration, there may be an improvement of ASEAN, but I think I'm rather pessimistic about that. In terms of the third way that's in Tim's question, we obsess about the US and China as if these are the only two poles. Maybe the third pole are a conglomeration of these other major powers that we've been talking about: India, Japan, Australia. If they can work together, if ASEAN can draw them in more substantively, that might be your third way, rather than simply being forever caught in this dance between the elephants, as the Southeast Asians like to say.
Thank you, Euan. Lynn.
Thanks so much, Robert. Like Euan, I'm not very optimistic about ASEAN being able to coordinate the positions more effectively. Aaron mentioned the ASEAN state communique that's coming up in terms of its reference to international law, as well as the importance of UNCLOS. I think we've seen past statements where ASEAN has already mentioned the importance of international law and adhering to UNCLOS. The question in the case of this statement was really whether or not we would see ASEAN taking a further step to perhaps adopt a statement that would have been more in line with the chairman's statement, Vietnam's statement in the recent summit in June, where it clearly stated that maritime claims must be made according to UNCLOS. It's a minor difference, but it would have been an improvement of a centimeter. But even then, we didn't see that happen. I think, in terms of ASEAN's position on the COC, I don't see that as being terribly unified. A unified position would have been ASEAN countries actually coming together before going to China to come up with a single text, which then could be discussed with China. What we've instead seen is a so-called single draft negotiating text, which has a bare bones outline, and all the ASEAN countries stating their individual positions on the various positions. That's not, in essence, a single draft negotiating text. That is, in essence, several drafts or several positions, but just put in a single document. I think China has managed to divide ASEAN quite effectively. There was the instance in 2016 where not only Cambodia and Laos, but an ASEAN claimant in the South China Sea, Brunei, all three of them together with China actually issued a statement stating that the South China Sea dispute was really a matter just for claimants to the South China Sea, as opposed to a matter for external powers. And I think that was an under notice but significant development, and it's a sign of things. It's a small sign of things to come, especially if the economic trajectory is perceived to be in China's favor. So I see greater division rather than greater unity on ASEAN's part. Even though they're increasingly facing greater assertiveness from China. On the third way being middle powers, I think I agree with you in there as well. But the question really is whether or not middle powers are able to not only get their domestic acts together in terms of their own position in China, but also coordinating efforts together with other middle powers. And we've seen some attempts at that. For instance, the US, Australia, Japan trilateral partnership for infrastructure development. But there seems to be still very little movement on that front. And of course, the question is, where is India in all of this? And that's a big question mark as well.
Robert, if I could just come back very briefly on that. I'm glad that Lynn brought up the four-party statement in 2016 between Laos, Brunei, Cambodia, and China, because I think this is actually a really good example of the pressure that ASEAN consensus can exert on some defectors. And so in that case, this was prior to a summit that was being held in China with the Chinese foreign minister at UC outside of in Yunnan. And prior to that summit, all 10 ASEAN countries actually agreed to a single statement that rebuked China for its actions in the South China Sea, including Brunei, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, China was able to break that consensus by pulling the foreign ministers of Cambodia and Laos aside at the very last minute after it was about to be announced and telling them that they were not to do this. And so China was able to break consensus eventually, but it caused a lot of heartache I suppose heartburn in Beijing that ASEAN was willing to do this, on Chinese soil right before the arbitral tribunal handed down its award. So there are these glimmers of ASEAN unity that shine through some of these crises. And with a little bit better statesmanship and geopolitical statecraft from some of the outside powers, I think we actually could see more of that. And again, I think today's communique is a sign that there may be more of that to come if ASEAN can get its act together.
Thank you, Aaron. We lost sort of a few questions now because we are running tight with time. But I think Euan and perhaps Lynn, this is again for you. This is from Drake Long, Radio Free Asia. Great panel so far. There are rumours that the UK would base its newest aircraft carrier somewhere in the east or southeast, in East or Southeast Asia. How robust is the five-power defence arrangement exactly? And how do its members view its relevance to their national defence these days?
Shall I take that first, Robert?
Would you please? Yes.
Yeah. Well, there are two questions there. On the aircraft carrier, my understanding it is still very much the plan of the UK government to make good on its promise at the Shangri-La Dialogue, as issued by several successive UK defence ministers, to sail a Queen Elizabeth class carrier to Asian waters. We'll have to see when that happens, and the composition of the group, whether it multinational composition of the group, whether it includes other European powers. That will be a very interesting test of how a post-Brexit pan-European rainbow coalition does or doesn't work. I think on the five-power defence arrangements, it's something that it could never be remade again. It's a legacy agreement from an earlier era, but it has unique attributes and uses. It's the only multilateral defence grouping in Southeast Asia. That obviously gives it a certain cachet. I think from the viewpoint of the individual members, to run through them very briefly, for the UK, it provides an in to East Asian security that it wouldn't have otherwise, and which the United States is not a part, so therefore it elevates the importance of the UK. The same is true for Australia. Australia has by degrees become the most militarily important party. I think its relationship with the FPDA has a bit of an inverse correlation with the health of the Indonesia relationship. When things are going well with Indonesia, the FPDA matters less, and in reverse. I think for the two Southeast Asian countries, it used to be a form really of getting Singapore and Malaysia to talk to one another. Fortunately, that relationship, although it still is scratchy in political terms, has very little chance, I think, of becoming, of escalating to armed conflict. So the FPDA no longer has to function in that sense. And for New Zealand, it's similar, I think, to Australia. The limitation, however, is that the FPDA only covers the Malaysian peninsula. So it's a very geographically limited area. The question is whether it can be broadened in terms of the geography to include perhaps the South China Sea in larger scope and other observers.
Thank you, Euan. Lynn, you were nodding. I saw. We're just nodding in agreement. You didn't want to.
I agree with everything Euan says, even even when he's wrong, I'm still nodding at him. No, I agree with everything Euan says. I think on the question of the UK and its aircraft carrier, I was in a panel about a month or two ago, which discussed exactly this. And I think the clear intention is to send a US aircraft carrier to the region. The question in my mind is, and of course, this would send an important signal of the UK's commitment to the region in terms of helping to support a rules-based order. But of course, whether or not this is effective in the long run will depend on, whether it's a sustained action as opposed to a one-off splash. And I would like to see a clearer statement of the UK's perceptions of its interests in the region as well as its priorities. And I think that will be an indicator, at least a part indicator to me, of the extent to which we can expect a longer term sustained, persistent UK presence in Southeast Asia to actually make a difference. In terms of the five-power defense arrangement, when Drake asked how do members view its relevance to national defense these days? I think underlying that might be a question on, how its members view its the five-power defense arrangement as being able to be an effective mechanism in terms of meeting the challenges of US-China competition. I think broadly speaking, in terms of the Southeast Asian countries in that grouping, Singapore and Malaysia, broadly speaking, they welcome the balancing effects that middle powers, other powers have on the region. But the question is, what cost are they willing to pay for that balancing effect? And so when the question of having a military base in either Singapore and Brunei was raised a couple of years ago by then Defense Minister from the UK, Gavin Williamson, I think Singapore was at Singapore's response to that was an absolute no. And underlying their no was not thoughts that the UK wouldn't be a a fairly constructive player, but the fact that China, the elephant in the room in a lot of these conversations, would be very upset with it, and Singapore just didn't think that this was worth China getting upset over. So yes, the FPDA continues, because of its history, etc., to be fairly it's well thought of. It can play a constructive role, but the price that parties might be willing to pay for it to play that constructive role might be fairly low.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to finish with this question from Jeffrey Becker, who is Director Indo-Pacific Security Affairs at the Center for Naval Analyses, and I think it's one that everyone can chip in and answer part of. And the question goes, have we seen any shifts recently in Southeast Asia ASEAN perceptions of the quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad? To what extent do ASEAN member states perceive an increasingly active Quad as undermining ASEAN centrality? And perhaps we could start with Yuka, is Japan being part of the Quad, obviously, and just think about how Japan is viewing the Quad at the moment.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for this question. And I think I briefly mentioned in my previous comment, but I think the idea of Quad and the meaning of the strategic importance of Quad is also changing, since it's from back in the decades ago when it initially was founded by Prime Minister Abe's idea about the security diamond. So the Quad itself was focused on security, but now there's an increasing momentum to kind of open this up to not just security, but also maybe potential infrastructure cooperation or other more diplomatic, there's more diplomatic meaning to it. And so, but also just about Japan's, just my point about Japan's Indo-Pacific policy. So this Quad is one of the frameworks that Japan is hoping to do more in, but Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific itself is inclusive by nature. There's a lot of when it's being discussed, a lot of when it's discussed in the context of containment against China or countering China, it's more of a vision that's inclusive, and also it's not just about the security aspect of it, but it's actually more about enhancing connectivity or economic partnership. So I personally think that there's more ways for open, inclusive discussions about how we work together within these different frameworks.
Thank you, Yuka. Aaron, the Quad and ASEAN centrality.
I think there will be a diversity of views on this panel about the Quad. It is seen as a challenge to ASEAN centrality, probably least so in Vietnam, which has a relative level of comfort with some of the things that have been going on in the last 3.5 years with regard to quadrilateral cooperation. There is skepticism about how far India is willing to go and whether or not India might take a step backwards if things were to, say, get better on its northwestern border with China. But broadly, what I would suggest is that Southeast Asians are much more, and again, this is a generalization, but much more comfortable with Quad minus cooperation with the trilaterals that we've seen in the region. Trilaterals between Japan, Australia, and India, for instance, or India, Indonesia, and Australia, where the foreign ministers recently met, or it was just announced are scheduled to meet. They're more comfortable with trilaterals, and they're more comfortable with Quad Plus. And so we've seen since COVID-19 a number of Quad Plus geometries. And so they're much more comfortable with this kind of variable geometry rather than four really big peripheral countries taking joint stances on some of these issues without reference to ASEAN. And I am personally skeptical that because these are peripheral countries and because ASEAN does value its centrality, that it's likely to have much an effect on ASEAN and the positions it takes as a result of action amongst the Quad countries.
Thank you, Aaron. Euan, please.
It shouldn't be an either or. I think there is room to have ASEAN and room to have the Quad, and ASEAN shouldn't see the Quad as a threat to its existence. I think the unspoken concern probably gets to the China question inevitably, because China clearly it is at some level threatened by the Quad, and will do whatever it can to try and throw obstacles down in its path. But I think there's a realization now, certainly on the part of India, which is, according to reports, on the cusp of hosting a ministerial level Quad meeting later this year. That's again a very important sign of how things have changed under the direct pressure that India is feeling from China. So I think with respect to Aaron, I think that it's actually trending the opposite way, that the pressure from China is actually accelerating India's interest in cooperating through the Quad and the other trilateral mechanisms. Maybe there's four is an inauspicious number in large parts of Asia, so maybe in the strategic numeracy stakes, the Quad is on an uphill ground to sell itself to other parts of ASEAN, but I think it's here to stay.
Interesting. So two different views. Lynn, where will give you the last word here?
Well, I think the Quad in Southeast Asia is probably less significant and less welcome than it is amongst U.S. allies. I think it's either, some countries have, as recently as in November last year, that they're kind of unaware of the Quad. So we had Foreign Minister Locsin from the Philippines speak at a IISS event in November last year, and when asked about the Quad, it was a non-issue for him completely, and that's one end where it's kind of an irrelevant development for Southeast Asian countries, and on the other end you have for instance the former Deputy Defense Minister of Malaysia, Liu Chintong, write about the Quad and his concerns that it's in essence it's unduly militaristic, and that Southeast Asia and US allies and partners should really be focusing more on the economic angle in Southeast Asia. So I think the Quad is not altogether welcome, and this is consistent with the fact that the Indo-Pacific concept as a whole, the strategy, the vision and strategy of the Indo-Pacific still continues to face reservations from many Southeast Asian countries, apart from, say, Indonesia and Thailand. So I think if we look at how there are reservations about the broader Indo-Pacific strategy, which is really more an empty vessel that is capable of being filled up with things that are conducive or constructive to the region, and even then Southeast Asia is tentative or wary of it, then all the more so for Quad, which started off as quite a muscular security-based mechanism. So even now when Japan and others say it's about more than security, it's broader efforts at bringing the region together, I think the old reputations die hard, and we're going to see continued reservations about the Quad in Southeast Asia.
Lovely, thank you, Lynn. And it's always wonderful when we have a diversity of views on the panel. Just gives the audience an insight into the rich debate that goes on in the Institute, and we're not absolutely not guilty of groupthink, which is also good to show here. So thank you. We're slightly over even my extension of time, so apologies to the audience, but a lot of you have stayed for the overtime, so thank you for that. And a big sort of round of virtual applause as ever for our fantastic panelists, Lynn, Euan, Yuka, and Aaron. I've certainly enjoyed this session, this tour d'horizon on this extraordinarily important region in every sense of the word. So I hope you have too, and thanks to everybody, and thanks to you, the audience, for being giving us some such great questions. Many thanks, and look forward to seeing you again.